What's up guys, Pokémon TCG here, and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today guys, we're going to be doing a little bit of a different episode, and that is talking about rotation. The 2025 rotation is honestly the biggest standard rotation that we've, I think, ever seen in the game. Which it's happening on April 11th, so you may or may not have already had this happen at the time of you watching this, but this marks a pivotal point in the Pokemon Trading Card Game, with us losing all of the cards in the Sword and Shield era. This is the biggest standard format rotation outside of the Diamond and Pearl to Black and White rotation, all the way back in 2010 or 2011. I didn't play the game around that time, so if you are a veteran player and you think that that expansion is bigger, then I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. But today I'm going to be talking about probably one of the most devastating standard format rotations that we have ever seen in the Pokemon Trading Card Game, where we lose an entire era of Pokemon. And as you can see here, there are so many cards that are listed here for different reasons from different decks, and basically this is going to truly highlight just what has made the Sword and Shield era still so meaningful, and really what has been the driving force for a good number of cards and decks in this game so far, and basically what we'll be losing and kind of my thoughts about rotation. Before we get started, I would quickly ask to see if you're subscribed. I put a ton of effort into planning and making these videos, which can get tough sometimes due to me being a college student. Subscribing helps support me and my channel, and it allows me to make more videos like the ones you're currently watching. And if you want to help support my channel even further, consider becoming a member. With 3 different tiers to choose from, you'll get access to my videos early, get exclusive behind the scenes updates, you'll get creative inputs on new videos, and more. Every member will also be featured in the credits of every single one of my videos. Thank you so much for your support so far. Now, let's get back to the video. So, I have a list of 64 cards here that are all different. They've all had either significance at some point or are still recently significant. Not everything will be listed here, otherwise this video would take forever. But essentially, this is just going to be a video about me explaining certain cards that we're losing, what deck it impacts, and basically what the purpose of that card was in the format, and how decks that will survive will recover and recuperate, and also just some decks in themselves that will never see the light of day again in the standard format. So honestly, I think that we should just start with just a few of the archetypes overall. Just get it straight out of the way. What decks are we losing specifically? And I think we'll just go down the list. First off, I know that there are a couple cards in here that are technically decks in their own. Let's start with the Lost Box. Cramorant is a good example of it, but I think honestly Comfey is a better example. Lost Box, the Lost Zone engine, has been a menace in the game ever since Lost Origin came out in 2022. And honestly, we've seen Lost Box rise and fall multiple times throughout its existence, and really the only thing that's truly going to stop it is this rotation. And I'm going to probably say that a few times in this video, where these decks sort of are quote-unquote unstoppable. They'll just always be there, and the only thing that will stop them is rotation. So the Lost Zone engine has been so consistently powerful and ridiculously strong since its beginnings in 2022. If you guys remember my single prize video, you remember that I have an entire segment on the early days of Lost Box, and for a time there, Lost Box actually was pretty much the most dominant deck in the game, Sableye being the biggest problem in the Pokemon Trading Card Game, and I even said it myself on my Twitter. And basically, just Sableye was such a problem, not only with the rest of the deck, which had so many different tech options and stuff, a lot of which has rotated since then, but mainly just because Sableye's Lost Mine attack was basically unavoidable and absolutely overpowered. They had to print Jirachi in order to counter it, and even still, Jirachi didn't exactly stop Sableye. Sableye took a bit of a back seat in a lot of the more recent builds of this deck, but it's still very popular in online tournaments especially, and Lost Box will continue to kind of just be this really powerful deck because its structure is just so sound and it's so adaptable and versatile. So I think that Lost Box will just continue to be a threat until rotation, but once we lose Lost Box, and once we really lose mainly and most importantly the Mirage Gate engine, which is basically one of the strongest energy acceleration engines I think I've ever seen, especially as like an item card, which is crazy, we're going to lose a lot of that versatility and adaptability that Lost Box has historically had in significant fashion. So losing the Mirage Gate engine really does shut off a lot of these like gimmicky ideas, or it makes it a lot harder for these other Pokemon to operate, but really just essentially losing out on just being able to dump a whole bunch of cards in the Lost Zone for some people is going to be an experience that they're going to have to get used to. Another card that really does matter here in the speaking about the Lost Zone is Giratina VSTAR. Giratina was dominant. Like literally, it was Lost Box and Giratina were at the top of the game for such a long time after Lost Origin. And for good measure too, Giratina is still a very solid card. It's not necessarily used by itself anymore, and we'll talk about that. But Giratina VSTAR's Lost Impact for 280 and then Star Requiem for instant KO was just absolutely a 1-2 wombo combo of just overpowered garbage. Like, not garbage, it's just like insane. When they print these cards, they really, sometimes I think that creatures, like, they think of this really cool idea, and they're like, oh, okay, let's put this all together, and then they'll put everything in the same set. They'll give basically all the support a deck will need, and then they'll say, okay, ship it. And then when they realize how overpowered it is, then they have to start printing counters. Now, Giratina never really got a counter. Its only real big counter was like V-Guard energy and then Mist energy. Those are both special energies, but that's about it. So Giratina really losing out on that is just a historically powerful card. The deck itself fell off after, basically after the game started switching up into EX format and all that. Giratina lost its luster. Giratina Arceus, or Arctina really, picked up a lot of popularity in like Temporal Forces, and then it kind of fell off again. So Giratina is one of those cards that it's like, oh yeah, I guess we're losing this. It's not the end of the world now, but historically this card has been very significant. All right, next up, let's talk about, I'm just trying to go down the list here. Palkia. Okay, we're losing Palkia, and Palkia has had another one of those like up and down stories. When it was released, Palkia was the dumbest and like most overpowered deck in the entire game. I believe there was like one major tournament where it was just literally the finals, the top 8 was all Palkias. And if you guys remember the Astral Radiance meta, it's just Palkia. You look at Astral Radiance and you'll think, oh, that's Palkia. Back in the day, Palkia had the Inteleon engine, which has long since rotated. It's been gone for a long time now, but Palkia really still has made an impact in this format, using cards like Dusknoir as like extra damage, as well as getting access to a few other cards that really help boost it to another level. One of those cards being Radiant Greninja. If I had to say and talk about any card that was more detrimental than Radiant Greninja, then I would either, there would have to be a very strong case for it, or I'd be crazy, because Radiant Greninja is the single most impactful card from the Sword and Shield era, like this block of the Sword and Shield era. And I will I will die on that hill that Radiant Greninja is the most impactful card. Not only was it overpowered in Palkia and Lost Box, in so many of these different decks, but it also just, the Concealed Cards ability is so ridiculously powerful. Being able to discard an energy to draw 2 cards, in addition to all the other draw engines that different decks got access to. It's crazy to see this this card finally rotating, and I'm not saying that like, oh man, finally, but it's like such a slap in the face for a ton of these different decks. Like Water type has realistically, like Chien-Pao, Water type has thrived because of Radiant Greninja. Like, honestly, I don't think water type would have been at the point where it was at for the longest time with Palkia and then following up with Qianpao if it wasn't for Radiant Greninja. So losing out on not only the Concealed Cards ability for that consistency, but also losing out on the Moonlight Shuriken attack to do 90 to 2 Pokemon of your choice is absolutely insane. And I think it's really, really this card tells the story of this past block very well, where it's like you have these overpowered as crap cards, like these ridiculous cards that have such an impact on the game, and then eventually they'll have to leave. And that's why Radiant Greninja is like kind of front and center on the thumbnail, is because I realized how important this card has been in the game, especially with helping decks like Palkia even to this day succeed. And it just was such an oppressive, ridiculous card design. Draw engine and being able to shut down opponents' entire strategies on the second turn of the game is just nuts. So Radiant Greninja, I think, is probably the most impactful card, and really it's going to be crazy to see it go. Let's talk about a few other like decks first before I start talking about like tech cards and stuff like that. Let's go. We have a few V-Stars here. Darkrai V-Star, I won't go into much detail about it. Darkrai was kind of always there, just it never really got anywhere. Darkrai was kind of supposed to be the saving grace for the Dark type, and then that didn't really happen. Eventually, Dark type did get Charizard EX, but I mean, it just is like based off a Fire type engine, which is kind of dumb. But Darkrai really never took off the way people wanted it to. It became a tech card in a few different decks that wanted to get item cards back from their discard pile. But that's about it. So Darkrai was never really that great. But I wanted to include it here because it did have some notable success at certain very random points in time. We also have Dialga VSTAR. Now, the tale of Dialga VSTAR is another one of those like up and downs where Dialga, when it came out, was crazy. Like, I remember when it was like basically you played Palkia, Dialga was really good, and then it fell off, and then Temporal Forces came around, and Dialga was everywhere again. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it won Indianapolis. I was at that tournament even, so I should remember this. So Dialga really has had different engines help boost it up, and I think Dialga losing out on Metal Saucer really hurt the deck really badly. But it was able to bounce back thanks to the Metang engine that helped keep the deck alive. And nowadays, it doesn't even run Metang anymore. It runs Archaludon EX as its energy acceleration, which I think is like even cooler, honestly, than Metang. But it's going to be sad to see Dialga go because it honestly is one of the coolest designed cards I think I've ever seen while playing the game. Star Chronos allowing you to do 220 and take an extra turn. 220 is a really awkward number nowadays, but like back then, you can one-shot a Pokemon V and then take another turn and one-shot something again with a huge Metal Blast. Like, that's incredible. And it still can do that today. It's just like not as impactful as it once was, just because you'd realistically want to try and take 4 prize cards in the span of 2 turns in a row that you got. But still, I think it's a notable card from this era because it really was one of the best designed cards, and it fit into a lot of different decks, and it was just really cool to see this card succeed the way that it did. We already talked about Giratina, we also have Hisuian Goodra leaving. For you guys who are like longer time viewers of the channel, you'll remember that I loved playing Lost Goodra. Like, I absolutely adore this deck. Nowadays, it's used more as just a tech card in the other dragon type deck, which I purposely also avoided talking about with Giratina because that's a whole other thing. But Hisuian Goodra was kind of just also one of those cards that was there. Especially in this last little bit, Goodra was, like, as a deck, Goodra is non-existent. And so I think it's really cool to see this card, just how cool this card really was. And it fell off in the last little bit here, but it had some notable success, and I really enjoyed playing this deck and kind of tinkering with it. But Goodra really did succeed back in, ironically enough, I think it was Temporal Forces again. Like, Temporal Forces was like kind of the comeback era for a lot of these cards. And all I can remember really, like, my biggest moment is when I beat my friend Henry Simmons, who has been a 2-time regional semifinalist, with Goodra in a mirror match, where he actually lost his win-in into the finals against the same Goodra build that I was, or a very similar Goodra build to what I was playing. So Goodra holds a special place in my heart because it's just a fun deck. I was just able to do so many fun things with it, and it was just really cool to be able to play this deck over time. And it has had some really good success, and honestly, a very, very well-designed card. And you can't say that about every V-Star. Not every V-Star was a well-designed card. It was some were too broken, some were just super underwhelming, but I think Goodra is one of the cards that was just perfect as, like, an in-character card, and just as a card competitively in general. We are also losing Arceus VSTAR. Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, it's been an honor. Arceus VSTAR, the first VSTAR ever revealed. And if you go back to, like, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago on my channel, you will see that I made a very lazily edited Arceus VSTAR announcement trailer. And this really was one of the cards that helped me understand how to play the game better. And I played a lot of different Arceus decks: Arceus Mewtwo V Union, Arctina, Duraludon, Arceus Flying Pikachu. So many versions of this deck succeeded, and it was just a lot of fun to see this deck, Arceus, go through the different iterations that it did. Of course, it became a world champion, Arc Flying Pika versus Arc Flying Pika, and so that was always really cool to see. Just how it was basically able to unlock a whole bunch of these different cards over time. It was probably one of the most annoying and most boring decks to play against, because you know that they would just go attach onto Arceus Pass, and then the next turn they would just V-Star for probably like a switch and double turbo energy. I swear that combination happened to me more than I've seen people use Rare Candy Pidgeot, Rare Candy Charizard in the modern era. So Arceus VSTAR really just was a card that unlocked so many different decks, and it kind of got phased out over time, just because there was new energy acceleration, and decks didn't really require it anymore, especially once Vs and V-Stars kind of started taking a back seat to EX cards and all that. So it was, I think it's another one of those like turbulent tales that I think really just shows how far the game has come since the card came out in Brilliant Stars. So Arceus will be a card that won't necessarily be too impactful of a loss, but historically, this card is such an impactful card that it does deserve a major shout out for being one of the cards that defined the Sword and Shield era. Alright, let's see. We've got a couple other V-Stars, and then we'll talk about, or actually, we got one more V-Star, and then we'll talk about some of the problem decks from this era. First, let's talk about Hisuian Zoroark V-Star. Zoroark was always a deck that was just so close. It was always on the brink of success, and then it fell apart. Like, nothing went right for this deck, because it just was... I think there was just always one thing that it was missing. And by the time it got the thing that it was missing, it was already too late. People had moved past it, and it just kind of fell back into irrelevancy. You can see it with, like, Zoroark being released during the VMAX era, or, like, the twilight days of the VMAX era with, like, Mew VMAX and stuff. And Zoroark was basically just always barely short of taking a KO, and then people would move on. And, like, by the time they moved on, Radiant Hawlucha came out, and all of a sudden you could knock out these VMAXs as they were rotating out and leaving. So it didn't really help Zoroark. Also, the fact that Zoroark was a very fragile deck to begin with. It's a very, very self-sufficient card. The only thing that it's missing is getting damage counters into play, which was like kind of made better with Gate Draw Bog and Damage Pump, both of which are not on here because they're not as significant to the rest of the game. But just really showing how Hisuian Zoroark is one of those like hype decks that never really took off the ground is really sad to me, because I always thought this deck was really neat and just a super fun idea. and it just kind of failed in execution. Okay, let's talk about the problem decks from this era. I have a couple cards here that are specifically related to the problem deck, and some that are kind of just the deck itself. Let's start with probably the first of the, I want to say, 2 major problem decks from this era. That being Lugia VSTAR, Mr. Beast himself. Lugia VSTAR has been everywhere. It has been at the highest of highs, being the most dominant deck in the history of the game. And it's also been at the very bottom, where nobody remembers that it even exists, and just being kind of trash. And as it stands right now, at the time of recording this video, it's just kind of mid. It's in the middle of everything. No one really remembers that this card exists, except for those who are very faithful to it. And that's kind of where it's been at. Lugia, if anything, Lugia has been through the most iterations as a standalone deck, I think, in modern history. Like, other than Arceus, which is kind of its own story, Lugia has been through so many different iterations that it's almost impossible to keep track of it. Like, honestly, it's been so insane to watch this deck evolve, then devolve, then re-evolve again. And it's just, really, Lugia is one of those decks that you look back upon and you're like, oh my gosh, why did they print that? But at the same time, you look back at it and be like, oh man, that was a kind of cool card when it worked. And that's really not because of Lugia VSTAR itself. Like, to be honest, Lugia VSTAR took the back seat once it used Summoning Star to get Archeops into play. Let me find Archeops real quick. I think I put it on here. Maybe. Oh, there he is. Okay. Yeah, Archeops. Really, Lugia took the back seat once Archeops hit the field, because Archeops was used for the Primal Turbo ability. If you remember, Lugia has been through, like I said, lots of different iterations, but if you guys remember Rainbow Lugia VSTAR, there's a reason that the Crown Zenith era is considered one of the most hated formats in the history of the game, and that's just because of Rainbow Lugia VSTAR. Basically being the most dominant deck. Every game was you played Rainbow Lugia or you lost to Rainbow Lugia, and everyone wanted to go first, all that. It sounds very similar to another deck, the next deck that we're going to talk about. Yeah, so really it was sort of a test of time that Lugia has gone through. You went through the single strike version of the deck once. The rainbow stuff like Aurora Energy and all these other amazing rares and stuff, they rotated out. You had the single strike version, which was kind of mid, and then once Battle Styles rotated out, Lugia was kind of just like playing colorless Lugia for a long time. And then once it got access to like Legacy Energy, then you had modern day Lugia, which is playing Chinchino, and it's playing Iron Hands EX, and it's playing Blood Moon Ursaluna, Weirdeer, which Weirdeer actually is on this list. Let's just go quickly. Weirdeer has just kind of been in Lugia towards the end. It was always kind of there as an option, but it's seen more success towards the end of its lifespan, which is kind of sad because this card is very cool. It reminds me of Tapu Koko GX from all the way back in Guardians Rising, if people have been playing that long. But really, I think the story of Lugia is one of the most up and down roller coaster tales in this game's history, and I think it's a really cool way to, it's honestly just, it came out with a bang, and it's gonna end off on sort of like the halfway point between a bang and a whimper. And it's like a weird way to say that, but like that's really what it is. This whole deck has just been weird. The whole story has been awkward, and it's just kind of cool to see how this deck has really adapted, if for better or for worse. And yeah, that's really where I'm going to leave off on that card. Next up, we're going to look at probably one of the main cards that you clicked on this video for. You saw it in the thumbnail, and I'm sure almost everyone wants this card gone at this point, and that is Regidrago VSTAR. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Regidrago, partially because I just spent 3 months making a video about the history of this card and how it essentially, like, it went from zero to hero, and I mean, I'll still give, like, the basics of how of how dominant this deck has become, where it started, and all that. But if you want a more detailed breakdown, then I know I don't really advertise like other videos on my channel too often, but please go check out that video. It's the previous video to this one if you want to watch it. But anyways, I'll just give a brief summary here. Regidrago, when it released, Regidrago sucked. It was like one of the most hyped cards from Silver Tempest, other than Lugia itself, of course, and it did not deliver. It was an absolutely awful card, and people thought it was one of the biggest flop decks in the history of the game, and people thought, like, oh, it's going to just join, like, Rayquaza VMAX and Reshiram Tag Team GX in the, like, failed dragon hype decks, or whatever. And it took like 2 years for Regidrago to actually become relevant, and it all changed in Twilight Masquerade thanks to Teal Mask Ogerpon EX and Dragapult EX, but more Teal Mask Ogerpon, because Ogerpon essentially allowed Regidrago to accelerate energies, draw cards, and it basically was just everything that Regidrago was missing, and it also was a favorable matchup against Charizard for multiple reasons, and then Dragapult EX also just offered Regidrago a spread option that it didn't have before. And really after that, we got Kyurem. There was Pheasantipity, which was added. Regidrago struggled a little bit with hand disruption, and so Pheasantipity fixed that. And to this day, at the time of recording this video, it is still the most dominant deck in the game. And I know we're coming up on what is it? Prismatic Evolution's becoming legal. In fact, it is out on PTCG Live at the time of recording this video. But Regidrago is still technically in the official standard format. It is still the best deck in the game, and I literally just watched an undefeated Regidrago player on stream, finishing the day 8-0. So, I mean, it is still alive and kicking, and if you want a more detailed breakdown, of course, check out that other video. But a lot of people are excited for Regidrago to finally leave, because it has really taken advantage of all the overpowered dragon types that have been printed, especially in the Scarlet and Violet era, and now those dragon types will either have to A, fend for themselves, or B, they just won't be used anymore. Like Alolan Exeggutor EX, that card will never see play again, because Regidrago was the only way you were able to use it. So losing out on Regidrago means that the dragon type, the dragon typing as a whole will basically all just be reverted to Dragapult EX itself, but that deck is pretty successful in its own right, and so losing Regidrago is going to be losing the best deck in the game in this meta. But honestly, I feel like it'll be a breath of fresh air going forward, because people are so tired of having to play Regidrago all the time. And it'll be a good step, a healthy step in the right direction for Pokemon. But it will be a little bit of a sad story to see such a comeback story like Regidrago. It'll be sad to see this card go for some people, because this deck really has gone through it all, and for me as a day one enjoyer, I will miss it a little bit, but also I'm ready to not have every single matchup that I go into tournaments with be Regidrago. Alright, so those are kind of the quote-unquote main decks. There are a few other cards that represent certain archetypes and stuff, and we're going to break these down really quickly. Not going to spend a ton more time on each one, because otherwise you'd be here forever, and also they're kind of short, but we'll just go down the list, honestly. Let's start with Hisuian Electrode V. This was used in Cloth Terrapagos, or just Cloth and then Cloth Terrapagos, for the Tantrum Blast, and you basically combined this with Radiant Hisuian Sneasler and super effective Glasses, if I can find it somewhere. There it is. And basically, you could use Tantrum Blast to do 300 damage to Charizard, because of super effective Glasses, dealing ×3. And then you could allow the poison damage to do, you do the 30 extra damage thanks to Radiant Hisuian Sneasler. And Sneasler also made it so that way the Charizard player couldn't Fez on their next turn. So, very interesting, very, Like, it took a lot of setup, but for, like, a deck like Cloth Terrapagos, it wasn't that bad. So, Cloth Terrapagos kind of dies anyways to post-rotation, but it is cool to see that Electrode really did make an impact in that specific matchup in that deck. Entei V. Entei V has been in a lot of different decks over time. It was kind of like the staple for Magma Basin decks. It's seen playing like Gouging Fire, Charizard, and it's kind of been its own standalone deck sometimes in earlier days. But it basically is the same as Suicune V was and the same that Raichu is. And Entei just is very powerful in the sense that it was just kind of a very cheap attacker. And it could do a lot of damage very early on. And the Fleet-Footed ability is also really good. Alright, Radiant Charizard. It's going to be a sad day when Radiant Charizard rotates if you're a Charizard player like me, because oh my goodness, this card has changed the game. And honestly, it makes sense to see Radiant Charizard go. We'll just have to, if Charizard wants to play another card, they'll just play Blood Moon Ursaluna. But seeing Radiant Charizard leave is really a smack in the face for Charizard, but also for like any fire type decks, really. Radzard has been a monumentally pivotal card in this game, and to see it go is kind of, it's strange to see how the Radiants go. That's what I'm trying to say here. And Charizard and Greninja really are the two biggest Radiants that we're losing, because they just have been so dominant over all the other ones. Like, you've seen Alakazam and Sneasler kind of make their way back into the meta, but Charizard and Greninja have been staples in the game ever since they came out. And to see Radzard leaving the format and leaving Charizard with an option gone, it's just really Charizard that uses this card, is going to be odd. Now, for a time, there was a little portion where people did not play Radzard in their decks, and I even like called out on Twitter. I was like, hey, why is nobody using Radiant Charizard? This card is actually like broken against all these new like 2-prize beat stick decks. And lo and behold, literally the next event, people started playing Radzard again, and it hasn't stopped since. So losing Radiant Charizard will be a massive hit for Charizard decks, but honestly, Charizard is one of the decks that should adapt and survive rotation very well, and losing out on Radiant Charizard is losing out on a crucial piece, but it's not that bad considering how effective the Charizard engine is. And we'll have to see with Budew if Radiant Charizard truly will be missed, because just like, I guess Budew creates a sort of snowball effect, and like Radiant Charizard at the end of a game can just be a very easy plays it down, attack sort of thing, and that's not really available anymore once it's gone. But it's still been a very impactful card, and it's done quite a bit for Charizard specifically, and just the fire type archetype as a whole. We already talked about Cramorant. Okay, this is one of the biggest losses in this format, losing Lumineon V. I'm going to talk about Lumineon, Rotom, and Forest Sealstone at the same time. Losing out on Lumineon V, losing out on Rotom V, and losing out on Forest Sealstone is actually probably the worst thing that's happening to this rotation for Stage 2 decks. We are losing 3 crucial parts to any deck that wants to use a Rare Candy engine, because we have grown so reliant on using Lumineon V to go grab Arven to get Forest Sealstone, and to use Rare Candy into like Pidgeot EX, Charizard EX, Dragapult EX, and it's just awful. Like, if you thought Radzard was a big loss for Charizard, losing Lumineon, which I'll just read it off. Lumineon grabbed supporters, and obviously it grabbed Arven, and that was a good setup. Or it could grab like Bots' Orders or something at the end of the game. Rotom was a great setup tool where it could just end the turn by drawing 3 cards, which will no longer be possible because Rotom is gonna rotate. And then the biggest hit of all is losing out on Forest Sealstone, because both Rotom and Lumineon can use Forest Sealstone. It has the VSTAR Power Star Alchemy, which is during your turn you can search your deck for any card that you want and put in your hand as long as it's attached to a V. But with this rotating out alongside the other Vs, now you lose out on getting any card in your deck in order to fully set up. So really, if you're a Stage 2 deck, this is the thing that I'm worrying about the most, is I am starting to sweat about losing these 3 cards. Mainly Lumineon, to be honest. Like, Rotom has been very impactful, but, like, you can just easily switch to Cleffa. Whereas Lumineon, losing out on Lumineon for so many decks is so awful for the game. Because not having guaranteed supporter search, unless you use, like, Pidgeot EX, is just not good. But it's just going to be a weird adjustment. I don't know if Stage 2 decks really will... Like, definitely they will be hit hard by this, but I don't know if they're going to be, like, super suppressed going into this next format, and just kind of, like, losing this piece really slows the decks down, and I feel like, if anything, we're either going to head into a more, like, lock-focused format where it's just annoying and slow, all the games are just ridiculously slow, or we're going to head into a... or into like a turbo format where it's just all beat stick basic decks, and that would be a really sad thing just because we're losing the crucial line of 3, and it's just really weird to think about as a Stage 2 deck player for a long time to see Lumineon, Rotom, and Forest Steelstone go. That's really all I'm trying to say here. But we'll see how the whole meta evolves after that. Also, it's important to note that Lumineon is like a staple in most decks, so losing out on that guaranteed supporter, again, like I said, is just going to be such an awkward transition. It's really going to slow down how this game works, especially since now you're going to be reliant on other gimmicky cards in order to get your supporters guaranteed. Alright, we're losing Manaphy. This is like when we lost the Bench Barrier Mew all the way back in like the Battle Styles rotation, or like no, the losing all the Sun and Moon cards in when like Battle Styles was around. This is crazy, because losing out on Mew back then was bad because Rapid Strike Urshifu was just rampant, and it was really bad. But Manaphy, honestly, it's not that bad. Like, looking ahead, losing Manaphy is not terrible, because we're losing the 2 biggest snipe options, realistically losing the 2 biggest snipe options, in the form of Radiant Greninja, who has been one of the most oppressive gatekeeper cards in this format for Stage 2 decks, and losing out on an effective way of using Kyurem thanks to Regidrago VSTAR. It's just, Manaphy is not going to be as needed anymore. It hasn't really been used too often anyways. Like, sure, it still makes appearances and it's still in decks, but it doesn't really make a ton of, like, actual physical appearances in games unless it's against, like, Regidrago, which Regidrago's gone, Radiant Greninja's gone, there's no really point to play Manaphy anymore. And I think that's just a good send-off for this card. It's just like, it's so impactful. This card has been so annoying for anyone who's trying to play a snipe deck. But it's really not that bad of a loss for any deck, any Stage 2 deck specifically, because we're entering a format where we'll have Journey Together coming out later, where there's like Ends Darmanitan, but that's not as bad as Kyurem or Radiant Greninja. So Manaphy, losing out on Manaphy is not the end of the world. Speaking of Manaphy, by the way, it's important to note that we are going to be losing Canceling Cologne, which was really only used to block Manaphy's ability. I guess it can be used to block, like, Iron Thorns and, like, Klefki, Fluttermane's abilities, stuff like that, too. But it was mainly used to block Manaphy's ability, and I was using Regidrago, so losing Canceling Cologne isn't going to be that bad. Alright, let's look at some of these other Pokemon before we get into, like, the more influential trainers. Let's see, there's just a lot of these, like, gimmicky or, like, not as used Pokemon. Luxray V is a huge hit for, control decks. They can't just sit behind a Luxray anymore. Tank a hit, and then Penny Scoop, do it again. And that's a little bad for the Control archetype. Control is taking a massive hit anyways, thanks to rotation. I've seen, really, like, I've been watching a lot of All Out Blitzel, and just kind of how he plays his Pidgeot Control deck, and it's going to change a lot. There are so many things in rotation that will be lost for the traditional either Snorlax or Pidgeot Control lists. And I think we're just going to start seeing more of like a Budew-focused control deck, which is really weird to say. But losing out on Luxray, being able to discard trainer cards is a little bit odd for the control archetype. But then again, it's not really a loss for anything else. And so it's just a card that appeared in one deck, and that's about it. Losing out on Raichu V and Raikou V is going to be pretty big. Raichu less, Raikou more than Raichu. But let's start with Raichu. Raichu is really good for Miraidon for the longest time because, especially now with the Magneton that it has, that Miraidon uses now. But Raichu really has been sort of like the OHKO option against things like Charizard and Dragapult and things like that. For Miraidon, but it's not really going to be that big of a loss, to be honest. Miraidon still contains some pieces that it can keep going forward. Instead, it's really the biggest loss here is for Raikou V. It's just a very effective, very cheap attacker. Fleet-footed ability just like Entei, and the Lightning Rondo, just very easy to set up, can do massive damage. And that's really what Miraidon will be losing in rotation is Raikou V. And that's really it. Lost Box has played Raikou, but Lost Box is rotating, so it's not that big of a deal. We also have, Regigigas. Hold on, we'll get back to Regigigas. I want to talk about Zapdos. Zapdos is also another card that's just kind of helped fix math on a few, like, EXs for Miraidon, but like that had 230 HP, stuff like that, I guess. It's not really as impactful. Like, you've seen a lot of lists just not even bother playing Zapdos anymore, but there was a segment of time where Zapdos was incredibly crucial to Miraidon as a whole, and it's going to be a little bit odd to see it go, but honestly, if you're not playing some, like, these basically are like niche cards that if you're not playing that deck, you do not care that you're losing these cards. Let's talk about Regigigas. Let's talk about the Regis real quick. I've got two Regis on here, and they do serve different purposes. Regigigas, we're losing out on using basically electromagnetic sonar. We are losing out on the entire like Regi engine to begin with, all the single prize Regis. But we're losing the electromagnetic sonar attack, which is basically recycle trainers. But there is a new Dedenne that actually does the exact same thing. So, and it's honestly better because it doesn't have a 3 retreat cost. It does have less HP, which is, I guess, the only problem. But, I mean, if you want to continue playing that, then it's not that bad because there is now Dedenne. And a targeted bolt, 120 damage to a benched Pokemon, is not as impactful as it once was, especially with, like, Terra being a thing and being immune to snipe damage. We also have Regidrago, who is leaving the format. Mainly, we're losing the Dragon's Horde ability. Only Regis and Cloth Terapagos uses Regidrago. And that's not really that bad of a loss, to be honest. It's just like, you can use Mew EX instead of using Regidrago going forward. So, I just wanted to include it because it is kind of a little bit of a useful card in Cloth Terapagos. Let's see. Let's talk about Banette. Yeah, we'll talk about a couple of these psychic support engines. We're losing out on Banette, which really was very impactful during the Banette EX sort of resurgence that we had during, like, once again, Temporal Forces. If I had a nickel for every time that I've mentioned Temporal Forces so far, I'd be rich, because that's really when a lot of these, like, forgotten cards and forgotten decks really got a chance to shine again, and Banette was no exception. Banette had the Puppet Offering ability, or still does, and it allows you to get supporter cards from your discard pile into your hand, and if you did, you put Banette and shove it into the Lost Zone, which is just nice. It's a nice way to recycle. It's like Eldegoss V from back in the early Sword and Shield days. But it wasn't really impactful outside of Banette EX. So it's just a nice card that it like exists and that it was an option, or is an option that we're gonna lose out on going forward. Alright, we are losing Kirlia. If you're a Gardevoir player, this is your biggest concern here. Losing Kirlia, the good Kirlia, not the random garbage Kirlias that they have now, because Kirlia and technically Dracloak are the only two really good stage 1 Pokemon in these stage 2 evolution decks anymore, and that's just because Kirlia had the refinement ability. Discard a card from your hand to draw 2 cards. Incredibly simple, incredibly effective. But going forward, Gardevoir is going to have to start playing slower. They're going to be more susceptible to hand disruption, which is what they've been doing forever now. It's kind of ironic. But also, it's just going to be tougher for Gardevoir to set up. And instead of being able to go turbo through 90% of your deck in one turn to try and find the pieces that you need, instead, Gardevoir is going to have to play it more carefully. They're going to have to play it more slowly. And I mean, the whole format's going to slow down a little bit until we, like, find something that breaks the mold. But just losing out on Kirlia is such a bad thing for Gardevoir as a whole archetype. And I know I've time and time again said how much I dislike Gardevoir, just because it's always just there, and like you forget about it and then it comes back, and it's just really annoying to play against sometimes. But as someone who did play Gardevoir during the double Guardy days, where there was like the single prize Gardevoir, it is kind of sad to see Kirlia go, because Kirlia was a very fun engine, and Trade is a very good ability, or like Trade-like abilities. This is called Refinement, but I'm thinking back to Zoroark GX. The Trade ability, essentially, is just a very fun sort of way to have, like, it's just a fun engine, I guess. Sorry, I'm kind of starting to ramble. I'm starting to rant here. All right, we're losing out on Mawile with the Tempting Trap ability. Essentially, this allowed any deck to become a control deck. I'll keep this short and sweet. He used Mawile to trap Pokemon, and that was really it. I mean, it did have the secondary effect of defending Pokemon take 90 more damage, which could have been useful in certain scenarios, but it was mainly just a card that allowed anyone to kind of just stall out opponents just by having one of those cards. But we do have Wellspring Ogerpon. I mean, it's not really that big of a deal anymore. It's really just going to come down to, oh, I'll just gust up this big retreat cost Pokemon and then sit there with Budew. So, like, losing out on Mawile is not that bad. Alright, we are losing Radiant Alakazam, and if you are a Dragapult player, this is going to get a little annoying, because Radiant Alakazam basically allowed you to spread the damage to take more effective KOs, and that's a little bit annoying for specifically Dragapult, but it has been in a lot of other decks over time, and it's another one of those like cool Radiant Pokemon that really have had an effect on the game as a whole. And so it's just like all four. There's really only 4 effective Radiant Pokemon that have changed the game competitively. And the last 2, Radiant Alakazam and Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, have been the only ones that have really popped up at the end of the lifespan. And so just losing out on Alakazam is going to be a little bit odd for Dragapult, but it's still going to be incredibly oppressive going forwards if the game is not as horribly affected by Budew as the initial expectations have kind of projected, I guess. Alright, I'm starting to slow down here. I'm going to try and keep these more efficient and effective. Let's talk about Bibarel. We're losing out on one of the most fun cards in the game. Little Dark Fury, I'm so sorry, because this is his mainstay card. If anything, this represents Little Dark Fury's time during this format. He just plays Bibarel in almost any deck he possibly can. And for good reason, too. This card has been through ups and downs like a ton of other cards. It's kind of in a spot where no one really plays it right now. But again, during Temporal Forces, Tord Reklev kind of broke the mold with his what became known as Tordzard, which had Bibarel in it, and it really changed the game. And Bibarel has just always been there as an effective draw engine. Pairing it with Skwovet from Scarlet and Violet base allowed it to basically become a super effective hand disruption proof engine. And it was only used for Industrious Incisors. You never use Tail Smash. I think I've seen someone use Tail Smash like twice overall, and the one time that I've seen it, it actually won them the entire game. It was the dumbest thing I think I've ever seen in the game. But Bibarel, it really has been such a special card to watch, really, because it has been kind of the lifeblood of some of these older decks, and it just really has been an incredible card overall, and it'll be sad to see it go, but also we've got Rev of Room. It's not like awful to lose out on Bibarel, but it's also not really great to lose out on Bibarel, if you know what I'm trying to say here. So losing out on a effective draw engine does kind of hamper some decks, but it's not that bad. All right, we've got a couple more colorless type Pokemon, and then we'll talk about the influential trainers that we're losing. All right, Oranguru V, only used in Call of Terrapagos, just searching out tool cards, and that was really it. It saw use in Lost Box for a little bit, which was a little bit weird. It was honestly kind of really weird to see it in Lost Box decks, but I mean, it did its job. Really, that's all I'll leave it at, is that Oranguru is effective in the decks that it was used in, and I'm just including it because it was very effective in Cloth Terrapagos. It was never used until this point, so not too bad of a card to lose. Pidgeot V, a very, very strong and popular card at the beginning of the kind of control era, where we started getting more block lax and started getting more Pidgeot control. And it wasn't because of Pidgeot V, it was because of Pidgeot EX. But basically, Pidgeot V allowed you to just infinitely stall by just constantly using the Vanishing Wings ability to shuffle it back into your deck every single turn, so you could never deck out. And it basically just was like, you tried to win the resource race with Pidgeot V. Eventually, Control kind of moved past Pidgeot V because it was a liability at certain points. But still, an effective card for when it was used, and it's just a notable card on a good 4 Steelstone target, and then you just basically kept recycling it over and over and over again, forever. And that's really all it ever did. Alright, we're losing Regigigas. I already talked about losing Regi's. Gigaton Break, the Ancient Wisdom ability is really what it was ever used for, after sort of after Mew VMAX kind of rotated out. And that's just because it'll accelerate an energy onto, like, Pikachu EX, and that's really what Regi's has done recently, is just like, I will power up Pikachu EX over and over and over again, and that's all I'm gonna do. There is a new Regigigas that basically has the Gigaton Break attack, but it's for Terra Pokemon. It's meant for, like, Charizard and Dragapult and Gardevoir. Not Gardevoir. Charizard, Dragapult, Hydreigon, sort of these, like, Terra Pokemon. It's like where Gigaton Break did 300 damage if your opponent's active Pokemon is a Pokemon VMAX, which we haven't seen a VMAX effectively be used in forever. Like, honestly, I still forget sometimes that VMAXs are still legal at the time of recording this video during Prismatic Evolutions. So it's not that bad to lose Regigigas. It is sad to lose one of the coolest single prize decks we've seen in a long time, but it's not as impactful. It's just losing an archetype. That was pretty cool. All right, last one we've gotten is Snorlax. We're losing Blocklax. Thank Arceus. I hate this card with a burning passion. I respect this card. You've seen it on the channel before a long time ago, but I don't like this card. I really don't. It has done quite well. It has been very effective in the decks that it's been put in, and it makes winning against a control deck a lot more meaningful and a lot more uplifting when you can actually get a win against a control deck. But it's still incredibly annoying to face off against. Losing out on Snorlax for these control focus decks, goodbye and good riddance to this card. But again, I have to commend both the card itself and the players who are constantly grinding through every single game. Like these torturous games for both players of just sitting there and waiting for someone to do something. So, honestly, this card promoted a different kind of gameplay that not everyone, myself included, was a fan of, and that's okay. Alright, we talked about Weird Ear V already, so let's talk about some influential trainer cards that we are losing out on, and there are a lot of them, and then we'll talk about special energies at the very end. So, I know this video is going to be long. This is going to be one of those, like, super long videos, but this is really one of those where I just want to talk about all of these cards that we're losing. We talked about canceling Cologne. Good riddance to capturing Aroma. This card is awful. It sucks so badly, and I know that my friend Henry will argue against this, and a few of you Lugia players might argue against this, but this card is garbage. Literally, your entire game can come down to a coin flip. Not good. This card was always one that I was skeptical about, and always one that I hated since the beginning. And we've seen it so many times on like stream, especially where capturing Aroma flips the wrong one, and it's a very effective card if it works. It's just a free evolution or basic, but it's the coin flip on which one you get. And sometimes you just value getting an evolution more, or you value getting a basic more, and you just get the wrong one. So capturing Aroma is a card that exists in this format really only for Lugia, so I really won't miss it. So yeah, we're losing out on a kind of on a 50-50 trash card. Cool. Alright, we're losing Dark Patch. If you're a Dark type deck enjoyer, playing like Roaring Moon EX, this is a big hit, but you do get Zapdos Vitality. Like, the thing is that Dark Patch is not as effective. Like, it's not as bad losing Dark Patch as losing some other, like, the patch cards in the past. Like, we've seen Aqua Patch go away. Aqua Patch was pretty useful, but also it was sort of at a time where it was, like, the twilight days of that specific typing in the meta. So losing out on Dark Patch is really bad if you're playing like Roaring Moon EX or you're playing Baby Moon, but it's not the end of the world because you still have Zapdos Vitality. So essentially Dark Patch was just a secondary way to accelerate extra energy on, and it's not as big of a loss. When Zapdos goes out, I mean, all the other ancient cards will be gone anyways, so really losing out on Dark Patch is not that bad, to be honest. You still have Zapdos, and that's really what I'm going to say about that, is that if you're playing Dark Patch, chances are you're an ancient deck, and so you'll be fine. We're losing out on Energy Lotto, which is really was only really used for like Terrapagos, in any deck that tried to get like double turbo energy. So I'm not really concerned about losing Energy Lotto. It was a nice card to have back. It was a card that I played a lot back in the like Guardians Rising days. But since we're losing double turbo energy, and we'll get to that in a little bit, it's not that bad to lose Energy Lotto. And honestly, it's just another one of those cards where it's like it just leaves quietly. We're losing out on Featherball. Not really too bad either. Terrapagos takes a hit because you can't search out Featherball with Knocked Owl, but it was only used to ever grab like Pidgeot EX, and that was essentially it. So, and we have Ultra Ball still in the format, so it's not that bad. If you really want to, you can still use like Grand Tree or something like that. So losing out on Featherball, not the end of the world, not really that concerning. Just for that specific interaction, it is a bit like unfortunate for anyone who tries playing Terrapagos post-rotation, which we'll get to that. We're losing Hisuian Heavy Ball, though. This is probably one of the biggest cards that we're losing to rotation, as this essentially locks us out of looking at our prize cards, except for, like, gimmicky supporters that no one will ever use. And Hisuian Heavy Ball really has been one of the most effective trainer cards from this era, because it allows you to look at your face-down prize cards and get prize Pokemon out of there. You fish them out, you replace it with Heavy Ball, and it was just a very, very good card because it helped fix certain problems. If you prize a certain Pokemon and you don't want to have to try and take a prize in order to get that Pokemon, you need it now, Heavy Ball is your answer. And losing out on Heavy Ball is really, honestly, like, it's bad for the game. I've seen a lot of people start talking about how prize cards as a mechanic is kind of bad for the game recently anyways, and I kind of agree. Whereas Heavy Ball was like an option, sort of like a band-aid onto the big issue that is prize cards to begin with, but it was at least an effective band-aid, and it did provide a very good option for anyone who was trying to just set up or trying to get that one piece that they need in order to essentially accomplish what they need to. We're losing out on Lost Vacuum. Rest in peace, Lost Vacuum. You will join Field Blower and, let's see, Xerosic, old Xerosic, and Faba. It's crazy to think about. We're losing Lost Vacuum, which is one of the staple cards in this format. Lost Vacuum says that you have to lost own a card, but at the low price of lost owning a card, you get to get rid of either a very annoying, problematic stadium card, you get to get rid of a tool card on your opponent's side or on your own side. So losing Lost Vacuum is going to be kind of a huge deal because this encourages the use of tool cards, a lot more tool cards going forward, which is sometimes just really annoying and irritating. Who knows? Well, we might see in like the later bit of Scarlet and Violet, we might see like a resurgence in a sort of tool disruption. We do still have Jamming Tower, which is good, but it's a stadium and it shuts off yours as well, which is pretty bad for certain decks. But I think we might see another sort of like vacuum or like field blower type card come back into play, because field blower came out in early Sun and Moon, Lost Vacuum came out late Sword and Shield. So who knows, we might get it in Scarlet and Violet again, or maybe we'll just enter like sort of a drought where we just don't have an option for that. But Lost Vacuum has been a very interesting card, and it's done quite a bit. It's a very effective card in the game, and so it'll be kind of sad to lose it, but not the end of the world. Again, this is another one of those cards where it's like, it's just so nice to have it, but it's not that horrible to lose it, unlike certain other cards that are just like so key to other decks. This is just an extra piece that you're gonna lose. We already talked about losing Mirage Gate. I mean, the Lost Zone Engine's just dead. We're losing Switch Cart, which is kind of bad for basic decks. Basic only decks, really, because that 30 damage really can make a difference, especially against things like Dragapult. So losing out on healing 30 damage is kind of a big deal, but we still have regular Switch in the format, so it's not that bad. It's just, if you're a basic deck, it is kind of sad to see Switch Cart go, but it's not that horrible because we still have, there's still switching options. We're losing Trekking Shoes. When this card came out, all the way back in Astral Radiance, this card was incredible. Did it come out in Astral Radiance? Sorry, I gotta think back. I don't know if it came out in Astral Radiance or Brilliant Stars. But when it came out, essentially, I have the gold and it's Astral Radiance, which is not helping me, really. But when this card came out, it was everywhere. Like, everyone was just like, oh my gosh, you can turbo through an extra 8 cards in your deck, potentially? That's insane, just because you're using these item cards. And it's similar to Acrobike in a sense, but you get to choose if you want to discard a card instead of, But Trekking Shoes really just was able to like turbo decks faster and allow them to find their resources quicker. And for a long time, this card was very effective, and you still see it sometimes today in these turbo decks, but it really fell off in popularity, and honestly, it's not that useful anymore now. So add it onto the pile of cards that once were really good, but now people don't really care if it leaves. Alright, now on to stadiums. We're losing Collapse Stadium, which is a very good answer to Area 0, because it shrinks down both players' benches, but it also was a great card to allow you to either lock your opponent out of strategies, or it allowed you to get remove damaged Pokemon on your bench. And so that's a bit of a loss, especially for Charizard, but recently playing Charizard, I found another stadium, which I don't think I'll mention at this point in time, that has been way more effective and way more useful for the deck overall. And so losing out on Collapse Stadium is kind of bad for certain Stage 2 decks and stuff like that, but it's not another one it's just another card that's like, okay, well, it's gone. We lose an option. That's kind of unfortunate, but it's not that bad. We are also losing out on Lost City. Lost City had a huge point in time where it was constantly being used, and by almost every single meta deck. And it was just because you basically prevented opposing Pokemon to be from being recycled. And you could also fuel your Lost Zone by placing down Lost City. Losing Lost City isn't that bad anymore, because it's just a stadium that kind of exists, but it had a lot of effective uses back in the day, and just, again, another card that's not very useful nowadays. We're losing Magma Basement, so if you're a Gouging Fire enjoyer, or if you're like someone who plays a fire type deck, this is a huge loss for the archetype. It's like kind of losing for Dark types losing Dark Patch. But Magma Basin is even more useful for Fire-type decks, because a lot of Fire-type Pokemon nowadays want to have damage counters on them for different uses, like Monkey Dory moving it off. Sometimes you want to put damage counters on your own Pokemon because it'll do more damage, like Radiant Heatran, or like the Hearthflame Mask Ogre Pontiacs. I get this is just kind of like out there ideas, but essentially Magma Basin was always a staple in fire type decks, and it'll be kind of a shame to see it go. But fire type is not very useful in the game right now anyways, outside of Gouging Fire. Gouging Fire still gets to keep Sadas, so it's not that bad. We're losing out on Pokestop. This is the most influential stadium card from this era. Pokestop is my most hated card in the format right now. I'll just go out and say it. I think I've had a few segments in my videos where I've said how much I hate Pokestop, and that's just because it is a gambling card. You gamble for and hope that you draw into item cards. And Pokestop was just another way to turbo. If Trekking Shoes was effective in turboing, Pokestop was honestly even more effective in turboing. Because, like, you're not having to choose, you're just gonna dump it all away and hope that you get the off chance of getting 3 item cards. So losing Pokestop is really bad for turbo decks, especially like Roaring Moon, but not a lot of decks play it outside of like Roaring Moon specifically, or Ancient Box. So losing Pokestop is not bad for a lot of decks. It's just, it's like a very impactful card historically. It's just not as widespread as it used to be. Like Qian Pao used to play it, but Qian Pao is not really a deck that is good right now. So it's just another card that exists, that's been good historically, and it's just going away now. We're losing Temple of Sinnoh, which is another big card to lose. In fact, this is a more effective card, or more universally effective card right now. Just because it's in more decks than Pokestop is. But it's still not, like, the biggest and most useful card. You see it in, like, Regidrago, you see it in a few other lists here and there. But it's mainly just to block off Lugia from being able to have its benefits. And also to be able to block off Mist Energy if you're playing Dragapult EX. Or block off Double Turbo if you're playing Terrapagos or something like that against Terrapagos. So, it has multiple uses. It's just, like, it just exists. It's just there sometimes, and it makes a huge difference when it does. But there's not a ton of matchups where that will be useful. But Temple of Sinnoh will be a kind of a big loss for any deck that's trying to avoid being affected by an onslaught of special energy, which honestly we're losing 2 of the best special energies anyways, one of them being the best special energy in the game right now universally. So it is kind of bad to lose Temple of Sinnoh, but not, like, again, not terrible. Alright, we're losing Sharon's Care. This was an impactful card in a few decks. I mean, I don't know, honestly I don't even know why I put it in here, but we're losing Sharon's Care, which was an option for colorless type decks, and that's really it. There's not really much else to say. We're losing Colress's Experiment. This card mainly was used in Lost Box decks, but nowadays it's kind of just, I mean, using a Lost Box still, it's the lifeblood of Lost Box, other than Comfy's. But it also was used to, like, specifically not have to discard your hand and stuff like that. So it is a little bit of an impactful card to lose for certain decks that want to just cherry pick certain cards. But honestly, at this point, we're getting to a point where we're just like, dump your whole hand, or you can just Iono, Roxanne. I guess you can't Roxanne anymore, but, like, there's ways to just draw extra cards anyways, to where Colress is not as impactful outside of Lost Box. But mainly, Lost Box loses Colress, but then again, Lost Box loses its entire deck to begin with. So Colress is also a card that has historically been very effective, but nowadays it's not as big of an impact. We're losing out on Cyllene. Cyllene has made quite a few different appearances in a lot of different decks, mainly because it was able to recycle specific cards that were unrecyclable otherwise. But nowadays, Cyllene hasn't really had too much of a use. It was used for, like, infinite loops, stuff like that. And nowadays, it's just kind of like a binder card, or like really just a bulk bin card. But historically, it was historically effective enough to be included in this list of notable cards that we're losing. We're losing out on Irida. So if you're a water-type deck player, losing out on Irida is kind of a big deal. You're losing out on getting a water-type Pokemon for free without having to use, like, Ultra Ball or something like that. And you get an item card, which is also very good. like an Earthen Vessel. Most people would go for like Radiant Greninja Earthen Vessel or something like that, and it would just be very effective, but we're losing out on that engine. Then again, water types have not really been too good outside of Palkia. We're losing Palkia, so it's not as big of a deal. So again, we're starting to get to the point where we're getting to these like cards that are like, oh man, this deck is really gonna suffer. Oh yeah, this deck doesn't exist anymore anyways, so it doesn't really matter too much. But Irida has been historically a very effective card with Inteleon and like back in the day, and nowadays it's kind of just there for water type decks only because Inteleon has been long since rotated. We're losing Misfortune Sisters, again another card if you're a control player or a mill player. It's sad to see this card go, but that's kind of just how it goes. Sometimes rotation does that too in archetype, and control unfortunately is for control players. Fortunately for everybody else, you just lose. We're losing a lot of things if you're control players. So Misfortune Sisters, discarding item cards will be a lot more difficult because you're going to have to either use 0/6 Machinations or Airy, both of which are not as good as they once were at one point. And Misfortune Sisters was kind of always there, and it was not really... It's just been the most effective of the item discard pool of supporters. So it will be a little bit sad to see that go for control decks, but everyone else is pretty happy because they don't have to deal with this anymore. We're losing out on Roxanne. Now, Roxanne has historically been a lie. Really, I'll just say that. Roxanne Path to the Peak was a very effective combo for a long time, but we've seen it time and time again. Roxanne is a lie. It will basically never work when you want it to, because the opponent will just draw the exact cards that they need in order to win the game. I've won tournaments, in fact, where, like, people have Roxanned me down to 2 cards, and like, oh, I'm really gonna get them here, and then I draw into the exact 2 cards I needed in order to win the game, and I didn't even have them before, so it's like, oh, thanks, you helped me. But Roxanne was meant to be a comeback card, and we still will have the spirit of Roxanne live on in Unfair Stamp. So it's, and like Iono already exists anyways, so Hand Disruption is not gone, but it's been dramatically lowered in effectiveness thanks to Pheasantipede EX. Again, just another quick shout out to another one of my other videos if you want to sorry for the advertising again, but I've talked about Hand Disruption and the fall of its effectiveness in another video if you want to watch that. Alright, we're losing Team Yell's Cheer, which allows you to shuffle up to 3 Pokemon or other supporter cards back into your deck. Essentially, it's like a Super Rod and a Pal Pad combined. This was used a lot during the sort of control stall days, where you just sat there infinitely putting back Team Yell's Cheer with Cyllene, and then you put back Cyllene with Team Yell's Cheer, blah, blah, blah. So, another card that's not necessarily too useful now, but it was historically a very useful card. We are losing Thornton. Rest in peace to one of my favorite supporter cards ever. Thornton is like Ninja Boy from the very old days, where basically Thornton allows you to recycle a Pokemon and reuse it in the same turn. Charizard basically used Thornton to the fullest. We also had decks like Terrapagos use Thornton effectively, where you basically just swap out a Pokemon and then, like, out of nowhere really, and then you can reuse it. Like, Charizard basically would be like, oh man, I only got 1 Charmander down and my opponent just knocked out the Charmander. Well, surprise, I can turn my now useless Rotom V into the Charmander, and then I can Rare Candy Charizard and attack with it out of nowhere with Thornton. So, losing Thornton is going to be another piece of like, that sucks to lose, but it's like just one of those super cool tech cards that has not really been good or that great until now, and that's honestly okay. Like, it's a very awesome card. I love Thornton, but it's like, it's alright to see this card go, just because it's only effective in a few decks, and it's a very, like, niche use card anyways. It's not, like, widely, universally used as, like, Radiant Greninja or something like that. We already talked about Forest Seal Stone. Speaking of widely used, Forest Seal Stone, we're losing that, but we already talked about that. We are losing super effective classes like I talked about, and then we are losing Double Turbo Energy. One of, I would say, if I made a top 5 list of like the most effective cards we're losing, honestly, I think that if I look at the thumbnail, like I'm actually looking at the thumbnail right now, I think actually I have my like top 6 cards just right there on the thumbnail. Radiant Greninja, Rotom V, or like, I guess there are a few that are more effective and whatever, but these are kind of like the staples of this format, and really, Double Turbo is definitely one of them. Losing out on Double Turbo Energy is going to be awful for any deck that has a 2 colorless attack cost, because they no longer can get that. Terrapagos is going to suffer. I mean, it's already suffered enough, because, like, I guess the meta moved past Terrapagos very quickly, and, now with, like, Budew entering the format, Double Turbo Energy would be awesome for both sides in a Budew matchup. Budew can use it to do 0 damage and effectively stall forever, and decks that don't want Budew to, like, don't like Budew can just use Double Turbo on, like, Terrapagos and just get a quick knockout on that Budew. So it's really just losing out on Double Turbo Energy is one of the biggest pieces that we're losing to rotation, mainly because, like, Terrapagos is going to miss it, but also, like, a few other decks like using Double Turbo Energy in niche scenarios like Iron Thorns, stuff like that. So losing Double Turbo is a huge deal because it just shuts off the opportunity to use these double colorless attacks without having to accelerate in some suboptimal way. And it's going to be a little sad to see this card go, but that's, I guess, it's a card that we might see again in the future. We've seen it reprinted time and time again. We've seen double colorless energy turn into twin energy, and now we have double turbo energy. And so double turbo will be joining the other two in expanded. Alright, we're also losing gift energy, and this is really only ever used in Lugia. We're losing Lugia, so it's not that bad to lose gift energy. It just basically was a great way to hand disrupt, proof yourself, and that's really it. So honestly, I think that's all of them. Oh my gosh. Okay, we did it, fellas. I think we talked about every single card on this 64 card list of cards that we are losing. So that's really it. And that's where we're going to be losing to rotation. These are the most effective cards that we're going to lose to rotation. There are hundreds more that we're losing to rotation, but then again, it's not that bad. As you saw with a lot of these cards that I talked about, it's not terrible to lose some of these cards, but there are certain cards that are going to be dearly missed, and losing them is just, I guess, so awful for certain decks and archetypes in the game. But I think that even though this is the biggest rotation since the Diamond Pearl era, this is the most impactful one, it's not that bad to lose. And honestly, going forward, I think that the game will rebuild. It'll be a slower game. It'll be suboptimal for a long time. But I think that the Pokemon TCG will easily rebuild over the course of the next few months, few sets, I guess. And we'll just move past, honestly, one of the most impactful eras of Pokemon, with some of the most diverse cards and most powerful and useful cards in this era. So I think that's really where I'm going to leave off this video. It has been an honor to play with some of these cards. I still probably will play with quite a few of these cards in a few more videos before we hit rotation. But it has truly been an honor to see some of these cards since the very beginning of this format. Kind of, even before this format, just kind of define the game. Or we have comeback stories of these useless cards becoming useful. And that's always the magic of rotation, is you get a set, even though you're losing out on these incredibly useful cards that make your deck better, you get to look back at really and appreciate how effective those cards were. You never know how much something affects a deck, or really just affects you as a person, until it's gone. And it's just nice to see these cards get the send-off that they really not necessarily deserve, but like they get the send-off that it's an appropriate time for these cards to leave. And especially for cards like Radiant Greninja and for Regidrago, this is their perfect stopping point. I guess not for Regidrago. Regidrago wants to stay around forever. But for cards like Radiant Greninja or like Giratina, Lugia, this is a good like even Dark Patch, stuff like that, this is a good stopping point for them. Because they haven't, some of these cards have really fallen off, and so it's like they'll just go out quietly. Other cards like Radiant Charizard will go out with a bang, and I think really that's just the magic of how this game works. And it's just to keep the game healthy, you gotta get rid of some of these overpowered cards that we've had in the past. So yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, God bless, have fun. We'll see you out there, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all so much for watching.